Assalamualaikum. In this video, we will be discussing on chapter 2, which is the cellular respiration. We will begin with the structure of ATP and significance of ATP. So energy is really important because all living things or organisms need it. Energy is the capacity to do work. It is used for growth, movement, reproduction, repairing or maintenance of the cell inside our body. If you have lots of energy, then you are able to do lots of work. But if you have less of energy, then you are not able to do much of work. So living cells requiring energy from outside sources, either from physical or chemical form from cell's environment. For example, of physical form, the sunlight, while example of chemical form, food that you eat, for example the glucose. For example, in this diagram, some of the animal like hippopotamus obtain energy by eating plants. So some of the living things, as I said earlier, requiring energy from sunlight. Others eat living things to obtain the energy. So as a result, the energy flow in ecosystem. The ultimate source of energy in ecosystem is the sunlight. Producers use photosynthesis to convert sunlight into energy. Example, photosynthesis generates oxygen and organic molecules which are used in cellular respiration. In cellular respiration, the cells use chemical energy stored in organic molecules and oxygen to generate ATP, which in return powers the work and release carbon dioxide and water that will be used for photosynthetic pigments or photosynthetic organism. Okay, in cellular respiration, the function of cellular respiration is to make ATP. That's the molecule that we use for growth, for movement, or anything else inside our body. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. It is a ribonucleotide, one of the monomer in RNA. The sugar is ribose. Attached at one side of ribose is the nitrogenous base adenine, and attached at the other side of ribose is the triphosphate group. ATP, known as energy carrier or universal energy carrier. ATP is a high energy molecule that stores and transports energy within our cells. ATP will power cellular work by coupling exergonic reaction to endergonic reaction. So how does we get energy from ATP? Cells can hydrolyze the bond between the third and second groups of phosphate, which convert ATP into lower energy part, which is known as ADP. So ADP stands for adenosine diphosphate because it has only two phosphate group. When ATP convert to ADP and into inorganic phosphate by using water, by addition of water, that's why the name of this process is hydrolysis, using water to break down the bond. Okay, then it means there is release of energy from ATP that we will use for cellular work. And then living things are constantly carrying out the conversion of ATP to ADP, and then ADP plus inorganic phosphate to ADP again to stay alive. So that means living things constantly regenerate ATP by combining ADP and inorganic phosphate. And that reaction need energy from outside. One of the food or sources that help the conversion of ADP and phosphate inorganic to ATP is the glucose, the monomer with the formula C6H12O6. Okay, look at the diagram. In order to regenerate the ATP, energy is needed. That energy comes from the catabolism and used to phosphorylate ADP and phosphate inorganic. Okay, each process of hydrolysis or synthesis of ATP catalyzed by specific enzymes. Okay, what are the importance of ATP and how ATP performs work? What are the categories of work that use ATP? Okay, number one, ATP provides energy for movement. For example, movement of cilia or flagella, or movement of chromosomes during mitosis or meiosis, or for example, for muscle contraction. This diagram showing that ATP help myosin detach at the actin and then detach from the actin. So detachment and attachment of myosin at the actin can lead to the muscle contraction. You don't need to remember the diagram, just remember example of the movement. And then number 2, ATP provides energy for chemical work. For example, pushing of endergonic reactions such as synthesis of polymers from monomers. In this diagram, ATP provides energy to amino acid tRNA synthesis enzyme, which is this process in chapter 4. We will learn in translation, chapter 4, to help the binding of amino acid to the tRNA and produce charged tRNA. Okay, next, ATP provides energy for mechanical work. In a cell, taking and transport of secretory products requiring energy. For example, secretion of insulin need ATP. So in order of cells to secrete the insulin, ATP is needed to activate the pathway of the insulin secretion. Okay, next, ATP provides energy for transport work. For example, in active transport. In animal cell, typically it has higher concentration of potassium at extracellular fluid and lower concentration of sodium inside the cells. So in order to maintain the gradients of potassium sodium across the membrane, so sodium need to be pumped out of the cell and potassium need to pump inside the cells. So ATP will be used to pump sodium out and pump potassium inside the cells. Alright, so how does ATP creation actually happen? It is called phosphorylation because you are adding a phosphate into ADP to make the ATP. There is 3 different mechanisms to generate ATP. Number 1, the process is called substrate level phosphorylation. Okay, in substrate level phosphorylation, an enzyme take a phosphate from inorganic substrate. Look at the diagram and transfer it to ADP to make the ATP. Okay, for example, this enzyme pyruvate kinase will take phosphate group from phosphoenol pyruvate and then transfer it to the ADP, making ATP, and product form is only pyruvate without phosphate. Remember, in substrate level phosphorylation, the transferring of high energy phosphate from substrate directly into ADP. Okay. Mechanism number 2 is oxidative phosphorylation. This is example of oxidative phosphorylation. It involves electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. The food that you eat will be oxidized and energy will be extracted from the electrons from the food by electron transport chain. Number 1. Second process, the extracted energy is then used to make ATP by a process known as chemiosmosis. We will learn oxidative phosphorylation in next video. Okay, mechanism number 3 is photophosphorylation. It happens in photosynthetic organism. It also involves electron transport chain and chemiosmosis, just like oxidative phosphorylation. The only difference is that this photophosphorylation involves the use of sunlight as a source of energy. So in photophosphorylation, light energy used to generate the excited electrons, and then the energy is extracted from electrons by electron transport chain, and then the extracted energy will then use ATP by a process known as chemiosmosis. No need to worry because photophosphorylation we will learn in chapter 3.